Hey guys, I'm Manar Mohawish, Editor-in-Chief of Mint Press News and your host of Behind the Headline. With 2016 nearly coming to an end, we are dedicating this entire episode to improving media literacy by bringing you the top censored stories of the year. Now, censorship isn't limited to a story going underreported though. We're also digging into the re-emergence of the McCarthyist Red Scare. And in this Cold War 2.0 anti-Russian propaganda campaign, one shadowy organization is smearing alternative watchdog outlets like Mint Press News, Truthout, and Antiwar.com as arbitrators of fake news. And as always, we're here to bring you real news you won't find anywhere else, either because the mass media can't or won't report it. And a huge thanks goes out to our business sponsors and hundreds of citizen donors who make this all possible. Now let's get behind the headline. On November 24th, the European Union, that self-professed haven of free speech, passed a non-binding resolution aimed at combating Russian-owned state media, accusing Russia of undermining democratic values and seeking to divide Europe via its media networks. The document specifically calls out RT, despite the fact that less than 0.1% of European TV viewers even watch the network. It's the Cold War 2.0, and this McCarthyist red-type scare of fear-mongering against Russia is being used not just to disenfranchise unpopular views, but to muzzle watchdogs and censor alternative media throughout the so-called free world. Now, the same day the EU passed its resolution to counter what it called propaganda warfare, the Washington Post ran a hit piece outing many progressive and alternative watchdog journalism outlets as Russian propaganda tools. According to the report, these outlets, including Mint Press, Truthout, and Truthdig, were responsible for handing Donald Trump the presidency by publishing fake news about Hillary Clinton during the campaign. Now, the bulk of the Post report relied on ProperNot, a mysterious online organization that made its social media debut in August. ProperNot states that by its standards, Russian propaganda includes any site which criticizes the US, Obama, Hillary Clinton, the EU, Angela Merkel, NATO, Ukraine, Jewish people, US allies, the mainstream media, and Democrats, the center-right, and even the center-left and moderates of all stripes. Now that's broad to say the least, but it boils down to this. If you're a watchdog journalist upholding the First Amendment, defending constitutional rights, and working to revive the Fourth Estate from an expanding war machine and surveillance state, ProperNot will out you as a minion of Putin. And while some of the 200 websites on ProperNot's The List do publish stories which are blatantly false, calls to take action against fake news have led some writers to warn about the potential for censorship. Now, here to discuss the consequences for independent media outlets caught up in the fake news frenzy is Shatterproof's managing editor, Kevin Gatsala. And I began by asking him how we, members of the independent media and watchdog journalism world, can combat the real fake news and propaganda spread by the mainstream and establishment media. Check it out.
Well, I believe that it begins with people who have independent organizations investing in original reporting and investigative journalism. And if they prove that they are actually making a meaningful contribution that citizens can benefit from, then it's going to be really easy to tune out the sort of noise, the sort of distraction that these mainstream outlets are creating. And that's very difficult, I think, if you have a shoestring budget to invest in some of these things. So, for example, if you want to send someone to cover the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline by indigenous people and others who are allies right now, that's going to take money to send somebody. But I think overall, if you can find some way to get enough funds together to send someone to cover and produce something original on what is happening, then it's going to be difficult for them to accuse you of fake news. And, maybe they're going to accuse you of fake news anyway, and that is a separate issue. But I think that you start to drown out this noise by making meaningful contributions to the journalism that is out there.
Right, and I'm really glad you talked about that, because in this election, we saw Donald Trump referred to as a kind of Manchurian candidate during this election. And it's even been alleged that a sophisticated Russian propaganda campaign helped spur so-called fake news against Hillary Clinton, possibly leading to her loss. How much of this outrage against fake news is founded in McCarthyist Red Scare type of fear-mongering against Russia?
Well, first off, I think it undermines the whole nature of freedom of the press to create a blacklist where you put any sort of organizations on a list and you say, stay away from these outlets. We can have discussions and debates about individual outlets or groupings of outlets and whether you should stay away from them. But when you start to put people on lists, you're actually diminishing speech. You're going up against these outlets. And then you're saying that you potentially have a better idea of what people need to see. And then that opens up a whole nother debate. It opens up a greater debate about whether your outlet actually has the answers when it comes to the news.
Right. And I want you to expand a little bit on that. This leads me to my next question, which is, what are the repercussions of creating such a media blacklist and not only branding independent media publications, but journalists as well as mouthpieces of Russia or enemy governments for criticizing the establishment?
There's probably a little bit of it that is very real legacy of McCarthyism, leftover Cold War nostalgia. But I think some ways this is just basically laziness on the part of people who have positions on editorial boards at these media organizations who maybe are in the boardrooms running these corporate outlets. And that this is an easy way to explain why they have lost complete connection with citizens in this country. I mean, this whole revolt against the establishment media that we saw play out throughout the 2016 election, I think really has many of the leading pundits baffled at how to respond. And what can they do to come down from their ivory tower to figure out what not just the white working class is going through, but people of color. What are the working class that are people of color going through? And why are people so angry? And how do they explain why people don't like what they're selling through their outlets anymore? And why are people so outraged at the way that they cover elections, etc.? And rather than engage in self-reflection and improve the I guess we'll call it the product that they would be offering us, they would rather use easy explanations so that you can just say Putin is interfering in the election or Russia is responsible. And without giving any substance or fact, that becomes an easy narrative for people to grab onto.
Right, and I want to expand on that as well, because Gallup polls show that distrust in corporate media has hit an all-time high. About 60% of the American population actually doesn't even trust the corporate media anymore. Do you think part of this attack on alternative media is also just another, it's a David versus Goliath scenario, old versus new media? What do you think about that?
I think that people who are running outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times are very worried about the democratization of media and the way that people can now choose where they get their own information. It means that they have less control over us as consumers. And so if you look at this from a market-based standpoint, because after all, they're asking people to buy their news, they're not really peddling it as a public good. This is something that they need people to buy in order for them to continue. And for us, we still need people to, like Shadowproof, where I'm the managing editor, we need people to give donations. Mint Press News needs donations to a certain extent. People still need to buy into us in order to keep us going. But I think there's this very real concern that with people going into their own, the way that they see it is people are going into their own bubbles and retreating into their own social circles and just creating these little narratives that they can live inside to explain their world that is completely detached from reality. And what they're doing is rather insulting, I think. I think it's a really backward way of handling what's going on. Because the reason this is happening is because the political class in this country hasn't addressed, and particularly the Democrats in this case, and I think for your audience and my audience, I'm more interested in focusing attention on Democrats, haven't explained why things are the way they are and addressed the material conditions that are being created, whether it's through globalization throughout the world or whether it's through the perpetual war on terror that's been ongoing that has had great impact on our civil liberties. And when you fail to connect dots and when you fail to give people meaningful understandings for why things are the way they are, then they start to retreat into their own little circles and try to explain it through conspiracy theories, through their own suppositions, their own interpretations. And we need real, I'm not patronizing people, but the word is probably leadership. We need people who have the ability to actually engage in real investigative journalism, to connect with people and give them something real so that they aren't just grabbing at these different fantasies and nightmares that they think exist in their lives.
Right, and I really am glad you talked about that, because we've obviously entered, Trump land as we speak. So why is independent media that's critical of establishment politics and politicians so important, especially now in a much more right-wing and post-Trump world?
We are going to be able to give people that alternative vision in order to show that this is what needs to happen next. I hesitate to say that I'm building news around an agenda, but I think that if you build an organization from an understanding of history, if you know the way that people have influenced history, the way that different social movements have created real change, and if you have that context and you bring it into coverage of current events as they are unfolding, then there's something very tangible that people can grab onto. And they don't have to just feel cynicism, and they don't have to just feel dejection after they see an outcome like the election of President Donald Trump, and that terrifies them. Well, if you can show them that there are people who actually have the capacity to engage in resistance and fight back, and that we actually can win victories even in dark times, then maybe you're not going to see people turn to violence. Maybe you're not going to see people turn to despair. Maybe you can find ways to channel people's energy into something positive. But I mean, there's no definitive guarantee that this actually works. It's just part of your organization actually being better. And I think, the final thing I would say in this answer here is that we do have to worry about fact checking our work. I do think that that's something that is important. I do think that we have to not fall into the same traps that CNN falls into when it wants to be the first outlet to get the click, when it wants to be the first outlet to get shared on Twitter and get the most response. You have to be very sure about what you're publishing, and that will always be true for every single media outlet in our news economy.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin Gazzala, managing editor at Shatterproof.com. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Bernard.
Censorship, a tool often wielded by despots, is also a pastime of democratic governments and their corporate media lapdogs. Whether journalists are operating as part of a free press or as the puppets of a repressive government, the goal is the same: control public perceptions by carefully bending information to suit a specific agenda. And while our corporate-owned media may have thought they'd mastered the art of propaganda, a recent Gallup poll suggests otherwise. Over 72% of Americans don't trust the mass media anymore. And much of this drop in public confidence can be traced to the media's efforts to treat politics as theater and entertainment. It also doesn't help that media figures serve as mouthpieces for the corporatocracy and the war machine. But in both cases, the media has failed to deliver on its most important public service: reporting news and information via a critical, questioning lens. This is why a truly free, independent media is so critical in the fight against censorship. As the corporate-owned, government-aligned mass media toes to the powers that be, independent media is there to shine a light on conflicts of interest, threats to constitutional rights, and other issues that the public has a right to know. Now, since its founding in 1976, Project Censored has unmasked that propaganda surrounding the most pressing issue of the day, providing coverage that speaks truth to power. And today I'm joined by Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored, to discuss the top 5 censored stories of 2016, stories the mainstream media swept under the rug or manipulated to suit corporate or government interests. Check it out. Well, thank you so much, Mickey, for joining us today. The U.S. military is a kind of covert, widening gear that's engulfed much of the world in conflict. Your number one censored story actually covers that in about at least 135 countries, the United States is waging a very secret war, which means that 70% of the globe is suffering from some level of U.S. military involvement. What is this secret war about, and how has the media covered up this military aggression?
Well, Manar, thanks so much for having Project Censored on the program. This story is it's actually fascinating because even though people are, I think, somewhat aware that the United States is conducting military activities or involved in the so-called war on terrorism around the globe, it is striking that few people in the United States seem to know that the U.S. is actively involved in a minimum of 7 countries warring in the so-called war on terrorism. But Nick Turse over at Tom Dispatch and The Intercept, and also The Nation, wrote that actually the United States is deployed in 147 of the world's 195 recognized countries, which is an 80% increase in the last 6 years. And this is something called Special Operations Command, and these are called Special Operations Forces. And so when you take into account that, for example, on any given day around the world, the U.S. is actively involved militarily in at least 80 countries, doing various kinds of drills, carrying out various kinds of missions, training missions. Sometimes these are training proxies, maybe making allies in the region. I mean, this is kind of dubious or euphemistic language. And sometimes it means that they're practicing marksmanship, but other times special forces are carrying out missions, things that they'll call direct action counterterrorism missions. Nick Turse described some of these as low-profile drone assassinations, kill and capture raids. So in other words, these are significant operations, even Navy SEAL Team 6, Army Delta Force. So when you take a look at this, the United States is militarily involved actively in over 70% of the world's countries. And if you take a look at the U.S. military budget, which is larger than many of the countries in the world combined, eclipses the next 10 well over, this is permanent warfare state. And it really should give rise to the questions that, well, what does this so-called war on terror look like? What does winning a so-called war on terror look like? Former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said under the George W. Bush administration that the war on terror will be won when all the terrorists have been killed. In other words, to quote, going back and paraphrase George Orwell from 1984, the purpose of the war isn't to win, the purpose is for it to be unending. And this is exactly what we have in story number 1 this year by Nick Turse, is a global military hegemony by the U.S. that's encircling Russia, China, and threatening many countries and gobbling up resources around the world and creating mass refugee crises.
And obviously, we can't talk about war without talking about the destruction of our planet, our environment, and our overall climate. Your number 3 censored story is the rising carbon dioxide levels and how they threaten to permanently disrupt ocean bacteria. I mean, how exactly is climate change affecting microorganisms in our oceans? And what does this mean for the food chain and we as humans?
Well, it means things that probably aren't so great, Manar. We've covered numerous climate change stories over the years, often involving ocean levels rising, CO2 levels rising. One of our number 1 stories in the past year, couple of years back, involved climate change. So this is a recurring theme, particularly because corporate media tend to underreport or skew the coverage of climate change. And many of the outlets actually keep pretending that there was some kind of debate about whether or not it was occurring. Putting that fairy tale behind us, we have many scientific organizations that have been researching issues involving climate change. And this year, one of the stories we looked at, and by the way, your viewers can go to projectcensored.org and not only see these stories, but they can link the original studies and original stories that were researched and vetted by about 18 colleges and universities, several hundred students and professors this past year for Censored 2017. And this story involves Robert Perkins and a study for the University of Southern California. It was written about in The Guardian of London, and it talks about climate change after ocean bacteria levels will increase. And it's a strange The strange story, it's a complicated story, but I'll try to at least very briefly paraphrase it and then encourage people to go learn more. This involves a particular kind of bacteria, it's trichodesmium, and this study talks about how it's found in nutrient poor parts of the ocean, where it converts nitrogen gas into material that's used for other kinds of life. I mean, so this is the food change component that you mentioned. It involves anything from algae to whales, and then obviously things in between, and people besides, in terms of sea life and food consumption and so forth. The problem here is with rising CO2 levels, this bacteria could grow and sort of overconsume itself in sort of what's referred to in the study as a reproductive overdrive. So this is just yet another runaway spiraling effect of climate change, of temperature increase, that it seems as almost anywhere we look, from the ocean of air to the ocean of water to what's happening to coral reefs to what's happening to the parts per million in the atmosphere of CO2, we're really not just on the precipice. Many scientists are saying we're passing points of no return. And I don't think that the purpose of these kinds of studies or reports, Manar, is to be alarmist. Although I think maybe we should be alarmed because that would wake up people to this reality. We now have a current president-elect in Donald Trump that is someone that claims climate change is not even happening, or if it is, it has nothing to do with people, therefore there's nothing we need to do about it. That in and of itself is significantly problematic and shows the challenges we face. And if people were more accurately informed about the realities of climate change, maybe we could apply more pressure to even bypass some of the nation-state agreements and go global on this to literally do something to help change or at least slow the damage that's been done, Minar.
And Mickey, I just want to jump here to our final censored story. We're living amid the largest refugee crisis since World War II, with nearly 70 million people displaced, mostly because of U.S. Wars taking place in the Middle East and around the world, of course. How has this mass displaced people attracted private enterprise interested in tapping into a potential labor force? Your number 5 censored story is exactly about this. Can you expand on that?
This involves, of course, organizations like the World Bank and World Bank programs that sort of, well, they basically use the refugee crisis as a way to provide cheap labor around the world under the guise of humanitarian aid. Is again how this kind of works. And first of all, we'd have to go back, and Project Censored has covered this. Andy Lee Roth, our associate director, and we've covered and researched these stories in numerous previous censored editions, going back 2013, 14, 15, 16. Last year, a UN report put 60 million people worldwide among refugees because of conflicts in their home countries. Conflicts, wars, civil wars, Western expansionism, or these kinds of so-called wars on terror, which are wars of terror that are creating mass displacement. So when we take a look at this kind of shift in this mass displacement, where are these people going and what are they going when they get there? Well, many refugees are set up in camps, and they live in very poor conditions. But the World Bank decided that, well, maybe we can encourage investments to create sort of, quote, labor opportunities for people that are working in what are referred to as special economic zones. And this is one of the things they write about. But of course, this involves areas where people are involved in human trafficking, torture, wage theft. And a lot of this stuff is outsourced from U.S. corporations. So, in fact, Lazar writes that at times of mass human displacement from these wars, we really need to be asking questions about the political implications that encourage Western companies to target and profit from labor from people that are violently uprooted from their homes. And this is a World Bank program. The UN is writing about these problems. And of course, we have a couple intrepid independent journalists writing about this. Again, we keep hearing about the flap of fake news. And it's ironic that many of the people that seem to be listed from Prop or Not or the Washington Post propaganda article about alleged fake news literally include independent journalists and organizations that publish these very factual, significant stories, the very ones that we highlight at Project Censored every year, and we've been doing for the last 40 years. So again, I'd urge your viewers to go to projectcensored.org, check out the work that we're doing there and the stories we reviewed in Censored 2017. Get a copy of Censored 2017. There's a lot more in it other than the top stories, including issues on the election primary, CIA media, public relations firms and service to the transnational capitalist class, surveillance, and more. And more importantly, if you go to the website, you can link literally to the stories that we have vetted, researched, and then reposted to catapult more of the significant work of actual independent journalism and the importance it holds in a society that purports to hold free press principles.
And Mickey, we just have a couple of minutes left, but Project Censored just celebrated its 40-year anniversary. And as we talk about the state of the press and censored stories and this fake news frenzy, tell me why the work that you do is so important.
What we need is critical media literacy education, and Project Censored has been doing that for the last 40 years, and we're now doing it with a new project called the Global Critical Media Literacy Project, teamed up with our partners at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut for the Media Literacy Digital Culture Program, ACME, the Action Coalition for Media Education. I urge people to go online and see our work for critical media education. What we need is critical thinking. What we need is a strong independent press. We do not need censorship. We do not need labeling. We do not need lists or blacklists and so forth. What we need is open dialogue and critical thought, and we need a lot more of it. And we're not getting it from the New York Times. We're not getting it from CNN. We're certainly not getting it from Fox or the Washington Post. So if you're looking for fake news sources, look no further than the corporate media and their deep state sponsors. If you're looking to be your own independent and critical thinker, then I'd say you could check out projectcensored.org and a whole host of other independent outlets. To finish, we dedicated our book this year to the late, great Ben Bagdikian, who was the author of Media Monopoly, who wrote, "Media power is political power. To give citizens a choice in ideas and information is to give them a choice in politics. If a nation is narrowly controlled information, it will soon have narrowly controlled politics." And that statement is ever relevant today, Manar, and the work at Project Censored really aims to try to diversify and broaden our pools of information and support true independent journalism and critical media literacy education.
Thank you so much, Mickey, for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you again for joining us today. Make sure to tune in next week for another dose of real news. In the meantime, the conversation continues on Facebook and on Twitter at Manar, MUH. See you then.